Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. I'm starting this off today. I am Barney, and I'm joined here with my co-host, and he is
Jacob.
And we are honored to have another guest today. Today's guest is someone that I've known for a very long time. In fact, he told me that just how long we've known each other, and I didn't realize that it was even that long. And our guest today, he is...
Hi, I'm Chris Matsos.
And today we asked Chris to be on the show because we thought it would be interesting to look into the world of theater. Theater, boy, I guess ever since the first people sat around a campfire and someone started telling stories, maybe that was the first one-man show, I guess, or one-person show. And as the stories got bigger, the stage got bigger, and theater was born. And theater has a different reputation, I guess, depending on who you talk to. I remember hearing a rabbi, written in history, saying, blessed is the person whose shadow never darkens the door of a theater. And on the other hand, if I can tell a joke, at the university where I was teaching, one person was teaching a class about Japan and culture. And as the class was being introduced, someone kind of introduced the class saying, what do you students think? Can you guys explain the difference between No and Kabuki? And my friend who was teaching the class, he said, how fast you fall asleep? So theater is one of those art forms that I think encompasses the collective unconscious of stories so much better than anything else that we have out there. And just as, my introduction mentioning, someone who was in Jerusalem, someone, in Japan, it's this universal art form that has, maybe coincidentally was a part of cultures all around the world and was used for teaching, for remembering stories, for, I guess for catharsis, this wonderful feeling that we get as we're watching a play, something being performed live in front of, as a part of the audience. And part of our podcast looking at the kind of in-between spaces, the places where different cultures and different themes come together, it just seems natural that we take a moment today in an episode and discuss theater. And we're so lucky to have Chris here to be our guide. And the question I hope to get us started off with is, how about theater that's this ancient art form that has been used in so many different ways, and now we find ourselves today with so many things competing for our attention, big and small. And now we can have, movies in our living room at the same time that are in the movie theater. And, there's even less reason for us to maybe think about watching something on stage. I don't know, Chris, what do you think is theater's role in teaching or being, or how it is in this day and age?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I appreciate that question. But also, let me say that I'm just feel very pleased to be here with you guys today, and thank you for having me. I love the podcast and appreciate the work you guys have done together on it. So it's a real thrill to be a part of it. So thank you. But yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that I've had to, in my work as a professor, it's one that has come up with some regularity. Like, why do we need this anymore? And it's so funny because in places where I've taught in the past at larger universities, there's even been a kind of, it's almost like in the curriculum, part of the course needs to be defending the merit of even having something like theater. And And where I am now, I teach at Hillsdale College, which is much more of a kind of classical liberal arts experience. And there, it's not really a question. It's like, well, this has been part of, language and expression for a very long time. So, of course, it's necessary. So I haven't felt really the need to address that question in a few years. And so I'm really pleased that you asked. And I used to just tell people, well, I mean, it's really funny. We have video, but that doesn't mean we don't need photographs anymore.
Mhm.
Like their progress doesn't necessitate the eradication of the earlier thing. And I think that theater is a root of most of what we have today. And that is not to say that it owns those things or it's better than those things or it somehow, you know, en- encompasses all of those things. But I really do feel that it's like a root. If you imagine a kind of culture and communication as being a tree or a great kind of plant, the roots must be some kind of theater and performance, and you can define it however you want. But and each of those little branches might be, watching a video on your phone, or going to a movie, or watching TV at home, or whatever the case may be. But without that root of live, engaged, um, in-person performance, we wouldn't have had any of those other things. And all of the people that we see in all of the, um, TV and movies all studied theater at you know at conservatories or at college or wherever. So it really still remains a kind of you know a great starting point for all of the stuff that we have today. And the way that you frame it, Barney, it reminds me, we're really where we are right now is a lot like ancient Rome. So theater itself might be something of a kind of a Greek, not a Greek invention, but the ancient Greeks used it as a really inherent part of their. It was like, it was not only entertainment, but it was how they preserved and communicated meaning for their various myths and stories. But it was
Mhm.
also a spiritual thing. And then when the Romans came along, they still had theater, but they added to that gladiatorial games and races and street theater and countryside theater and all of these other things, so that it was a huge spectrum, with theater being one part of that. And that's kind of, I think, what we have now. Um, so it just varies so tremendously. It's not only all the things that you mentioned, but Broadway itself is $1 billion industry, for better or worse. People come from all over the world to watch the latest kind of Disney-fied, thing. But it's also, I think, more meaningfully, there are groups who will go into a community and meet with and work with representatives of that community to figure out what the main sort of stories are about the history of that town or place, and then they'll do drama about that place. And sometimes people in those locations actually are in the plays as well, so they're able to tell their own stories in a really profound way. So there's like such a huge range of what the theater is. And I would say, as you said, one thing is to teach, certainly. Another is to entertain, by which, we might mean simply to like hold someone's attention. Um, to create community is a big reason that theater exists. And a final purpose might be kind of to disturb, and that doesn't necessarily mean to shock or, you know, gross you out or anything, but to kind of challenge one's perceptions of the world, to upset your preconceived notions. Um, and so, I don't, movies don't always do that anymore. Movies entertain, and TV entertains, and it certainly can teach us. And in a broad sense, it might create community and that we all gather around at work the next day to talk about what we watched on TV last night. But nothing can or ever will be a substitute for a community of people together in the same place, having the same emotional experience at the same time. It's an incredibly powerful thing, and it's tantamount to what happens in places of worship. And um, so I think that's where how it still has a place, and in the sense too that it is the most immediate art form. I mean, with perhaps, you can just do it. You don't need anything. You don't need any tools. Your tools are your body. And if I needed to stand up and start telling a story and using gesture and language to do that, it would be a kind of theater, and it just happens immediately without any preparation necessarily.
As you were talking there, Chris, I was thinking part of what you were saying is that theater has the capacity to change and impact and transform society or communities. You gave the example of people listening and going into local communities and hearing their stories and then finding a way to express them with theater, or even individual actors, you said, from those communities can play those parts, telling their own story, and how empowering that must be. So I kind of wonder, as a professor, how do you see teaching theater to students transforming their lives, broadening their view of the world? You said it can disturb, it can make us think differently, broaden our view, our challenge, be prophetic. How have you seen that play out in the classroom? Or if you want to push out the question more broadly, throughout your lifetime, as you came into theater and experienced it, how did it shape you? What were some of its impacts on your life?
Yeah, good question. I think that it's always heartwarming for me to see students come to realizations about theater in the classroom. So I teach both sides of it. So I teach acting and directing, but then I also teach theater history and literature. So I kind of get to flex both muscles, the theory and the practice, which is really rewarding. So, like, I don't know, probably the most profound way might be in acting classes where people realize what acting is, that they have the ability to do it, and that it's a transformative thing. So we usually start the semester, and I tell people that one of their big assignments is going to have to be to perform a dramatic monologue from a play, and they will freak out. They say, I don't know how to do this. I don't get up in front of people. And then so we'll do these various activities, and one of them will just be spend 5 minutes writing nonstop about something you feel strongly about. And they'll do that. And then I'll say, okay, would you just tell a partner what you wrote about? And they'll do that. And then I'll say, okay, now this partnership and this partnership come together, and one of you share with that group. And then we'll say, okay, now, oh, you seemed really impassioned. Would you say to everybody what you did? And then they're like telling this story about what, and then after, it's not uncommon for there to be tears after a short time, and for people to go from being very sort of bound up to all of a sudden they are breathing. Like, it's really funny. They'll think that there's a misconception that acting is perfection. It's a kind of performed perfection. Like, I decide what I'm going to do, I rehearse it robotically, and then I just show you that thing I've rehearsed. When really it's the opposite of that. It's making the plan, but then letting yourself play and live within the plan that you've come up with. So what I see in this exercise and others that I'm describing is people all of a sudden realizing that, and you can just see their breath go down into their abdomen. Like, all of a sudden, they from doing little shallow breaths, all of a sudden they're like, and they have a big breath, and they'll cry, and it's like they just have this moment of release, and it's really cool. And then after that, you realize It's not about putting on masks. Um, you realize that you wear the masks daily. The persona that you are creating and that you are showing to the public and to your peers is usually a kind of falsehood, or it's a very polished exterior that we want people to see, but it's not always the fullness of you. And so, what we learn to do is take those away, and you realize that acting is actually showing a very vulnerable, true heart of who you are. And that takes a lot of bravery to do that, to stand up in front of people and be your most vulnerable self. But that's the beauty of it, and that's another answer to Barney's great first question, is that, that's why we can have um, a million, literally a million different people play Hamlet, because over the generations, you're watching individuals live the circumstances of that sort of immortal character. So anyway, there's a real truth to acting, which seems counterintuitive to a lot of people. And when they get that truth and realize that they're sharing a part of who they are, and that this is a venue for doing that, it's really beautiful to watch. And it's a very deep thing. So that's probably the most a really exciting way. But there's other ways. I've done things in usually I do a kind of theater survey course where we just study, we don't really act, we just study how people have done theater over the centuries. And often that culminates in a project where students will get to create their own play, which sometimes they'll perform it, sometimes they'll just sort of hypothetically talk about what their play would be about. And they learn about the thing that I learned as an undergrad, which is why I love theater, which is that theater isn't really about theater, it's about everything else. It's about anything you want it to be. It's about where the theater will take you as a tool. So it's just a way of telling stories, and the stories can be whatever you need them to be or want them to be. So yeah, I guess the other part of the question, I don't know. I was thinking back to being very young and going to see theater. I was born and grew up the first few years of my life on the East Coast, and we would go to New York pretty routinely. And I guess I didn't realize what a privilege that was to go see Broadway shows. And my parents took me even when I was, 3 or 4. And so I saw like the original Annie on Broadway, and we saw Peter Pan, and Peter Pan starred, the guy who was Captain Hook was famously played Mr. Belvedere on, if you remember that old sitcom, Mr. Belvedere, he was the lead. And so like we'd go to see that, and then I remember we went to see The Empire Strikes Back in the movie theater. And I remember sort of realizing that this is all kind of the same thing, but yet not. I couldn't quite get what was different about it. And as I think back now, I'm realizing that the real joy of the live experience is that I was close enough to have reached out and touched some of those actors in the Broadway shows. I mean, I was literally 10 feet away from the one. And that is that's a profound thing. That's a very deep and I think kind of honorable privilege to get to be in the room with the lived thing being presented to you. Whereas, Empire Strikes Back was wonderful, and I sort of thought that was real too. I thought they were behind this magical screen that just made it look a little different. And my parents were like, "No, that's not real, son." And I was like, "It was real. It was real." But so I think the key is really just for me the live kind of thing. I grew up attending in Ohio their Ohio Light Opera in Worcester, and attended that regularly and was pretty close with the founding artistic director. James Stewart was a close friend of our family, and um, watching him, and I would just sort of study him. I would just so this is sort of an answer to your second part of your good question, Jacob. But just watching that man and his profound sense of timing and his incredible ability to communicate things both verbally and non-verbally, just with his body and his timing. Um, so I think that I don't know. I'm wandering here in my answer. I don't mean to meander around, but so I guess for me, liveness and is really the key that kind of got me interested in it, as well as just the fact, as I said, of the storytelling and the kind of myth making of it too.
Especially talk about your students. Um, I had the image of, I think there's a short story by David Sedaris about the drama bug. And it feels like there is kind of a hurdle in place, either that we put it there ourselves, or maybe the people that we know they're involved in theater. There really is a lot associated with theater, even just the word. But I get the sense that you have a lot of students and have had a lot of students that really just took your class maybe as an elective, as they thought it would be fun, as they wanted to learn this or that. Not that they intended to do anything more with theater. And then as I hear you, I realize, boy, this really has a chance to teach us so many skills, so many important things that we can apply to our lives. And I wonder, you seem like you probably have kept in touch with a number of students that you have had. And I wonder, how are some of the different paths that they ended up taking that weren't necessarily directly related to theater, but you saw that, wow, because they were involved, not necessarily because they were in my class, but, because they had part of them awoken to what theater is, it really kind of changed them and really influenced them. Can you think of any anecdotes, any memories of how you've seen theater and just being touched by theater changing people in that way?
Yeah, I have, and it's really, the real profound thing of teaching is when you see students that go on to be, something greater than you ever could have achieved yourself, and I've had that, and probably some of the bigger, more successful people I wouldn't want to claim much responsibility for, but you know, yes, I've had people in all different, I mean, such varied people who went on to become doctors, and people who are lawyers, people who are in business, educators, and I have talked with them, and I've had people contact me, and say, well, I'm a doctor now, but I think your class was like the most meaningful class I took in college. And I would say, why? Are you kidding me? And they would just say, well, just because it gives you a sense of presence and a sense of inhabiting your own body, which is really, critical for my work. And I'm like, whoa, okay, that's great. And um, I've had people, and I have had people as well who go on to be really successful in the theater doing really remarkable things, not just trying to sort of be in it for themselves and try to become Broadway stars, but people who have used it for education, for community theater, for really good works. And so yeah, it's just been a huge range of people, and it's always joyful to keep in touch with them. It's everything. Pastors, I've had former students become pastors and talk about the you know the relative ease with which they can speak in front of a group of people routinely. I've had people who've become activists who, they said, well, when you taught us about street theater in the 1960s, about how they would, protest, Vietnam or whatever by doing happenings on the streets. So I started doing that for, animal rights. And I'm like, oh, okay, great, sure, go for it. Why not? So yeah, that is but one of the things that seems to, as you talk about the theater bug, which is kind of traditionally thought of as the, someone being exposed to a theater experience and having such a great time that, and at its most reductive, I think people will talk about that as, well, I was on stage and I felt this profound thing. And so I realized I could never do anything other than that again. And I don't think I ever had really myself an experience like that. I was just surrounded by it, and I had, both my mom and dad were involved in it. And so I kind of thought, getting involved was a way of feeling even more connected with them. But one of the things that tends to grab people on a kind of an intellectual level, for those who have no intention of being on stage or in any way creatively involved, is um, the universality of it. So I tell students, to their surprise, that theater seems to be a native human, like innate impulse that happened um, in all over the world. It either happened miraculously, coincidentally, all over the world in such a profound way that it must be innate to our experience as humans, or humanity was itself at one time all from the same community and they were doing it, so that as humanity spread, they took the impulse with them. But either way, it is so old. It has to be one of the oldest things we have. It has to be right up there with, honoring ancestors and, certain spiritual practices. And I think it's deeply connected. And an example I give is, so in the West, there was the Greek theater in Athens where, for various reasons, only men could perform, and they would have these masks, and it was in a ritual context and festivals in honor of one or more gods, and they would put on the mask, and then they'd go out and do the show, and then they'd go into this little hut behind the stage and take off their mask and put on the next mask and come out as somebody else. The same thing. I mean, if you write down those characteristics and you look at the No theater tradition of Japan, which we spell Noh, but I don't know how it's spelled in Japanese. But it's the same thing. Only men performed. It was a masked thing. They retold aspects of their mythology. It was in a kind of outdoor pavilion thing. It was usually part of a Shinto ritual. They would even have a little room where, when it was time for them, before they'd go on stage, they would go in this like closet and face a mirror and look at themselves and then put on the mask in a private kind of ceremony. And then they'd go, it's almost like a, I don't know what it's called, but like a buffer chamber where they transform into the character and then open the door and be in character as they go out on stage. And the Greeks had something kind of very similar. So how is it that in the East and in the West, as well as all over the place, these traditions were not quite concurrently, but certainly without much contact with one another, these things were happening in such similar ways? And so even those who have no penchant or patience for theater, when they start to understand that, it's that can be a different kind of theater bug, a kind of curiosity that once makes you want to learn more.
You've mentioned several times, Chris, some possible connections between theater and even aspects of religion or spirituality. Uh, there was a book that came out not too long ago by a man named Kevin Van Hooser, where he talked about what he called the theodrama, the sense in which the Christian liturgy, or it could be, I guess, liturgy in any faith context, but in within Christianity, it's representing these core narratives or stories that are part of our faith, the foundation of our faith. And in particular, he zooms in on the presentation of communion, this meal of celebration of unity between people, but also a deep representing or retelling of that original story of the Last Supper. And the elements of the ceremony are old. They go back to the early part of the tradition, but we try to represent them afresh. And I've just noticed in my own experience as a pastor, when we do celebrate communion, we do use the same words, those words of institution, and we do the actions of lifting up the cup and holding forth the bread. And I notice that there is a real intensity, emotional focus in those moments in our service that is unlike anything else in the service to me. And I've heard others talk about that as well. And I can't help but think there's some aspect of that. The representing, it has to do with our remembering. It has to do with the sense of these are not just words, but this draws us into the reality or the story, the original story. So that really resonates a lot with me. But then also you were talking a little bit too there about being how acting in a sense is being in touch with your true self, or without all the pretense. And if you can access that, then you can be more fully invested in your role that you're playing, more authentic. And I'm kind of wondering, how can we learn from that process in theater for other areas of life? Like, I can't help but think of theater, it must be create space for like mentoring. Like you mentioned the person that you had appreciated at the Ohio Light Opera, and you observed him, you learned from him, and in a sense, he shaped who you became. Like, so that's one aspect, I think, of theater, of helping us grow and become more in touch with ourselves. Have you had experience with mentoring, or it sounds like you benefited from it? Could you speak a little bit to that piece of mentoring? Or
Oh yeah, it provides all kinds of opportunities for mentorship, which is just another kind of community, really. And you like in the same way that if you go on a long road trip with people together, by the time you arrive, you know them much more intimately than sometimes for better or worse, but it's always memorable. And I kind of think of or students I've had who have gone on and been in the military have said things like this, that there is this bond that forms through going through something together, and we can apply that to any kind of real thing that needs to be done, and we do as a partnership or as a group. And so theater gives us opportunities to do that, because you have a deadline, which is opening night, and people are coming, and they're going to see whatever it is you've been working on. So you are under a kind of pressure to work together to get over any differences, and to deliver a piece of material that is worth, that is going to speak to those people who are coming. And so you have to, theater teaches us a lot about creativity and a lot about resourcefulness. We don't always have a clear path to get to that end. We just know we have to get there. And so in that closeness, in that working together, there's a tremendous bond that forms. And I direct plays, all the time with my students. And you feel so close to your students when you've had that chance to work together. You feel like you're in it together. It's not the same feeling quite as in a classroom where the teacher has a certain level of authority in the learning experience. in the production experience, the director does have authority, but certainly it feels like we are a team and we've got to work together. So the bonds that come out of that are a natural kind of mentorship, and I truly love the students I work with in traditional classrooms as well. I really love them, but also in the productions, you just come out of it so closely, and you get to know them. Like I had a student last year who, um, on our final, we were doing the Shakespeare play Henry V, and the last day was the Sunday performance, and she almost missed the show because she went to church at kind of at a distance, and then something happened, and she wasn't going to get back in time. And I was there on stage with a stage manager, who also was an actor, walking through the role with her in the event that she would have to do the show. And literally about 5 minutes before curtain, the actor who did the role sort of ran in very apologetic about almost missing the show. And me and the others who had been trying to attend to this situation all just sort of like had this collective anxiety and then release. And it felt like we had been through something together. And so there is a real kinship, I think, that comes from something like that. But one thing I've observed about that, and again, mentioning, as you did, Dr. Stewart, who was the head of Ohio Light Opera, I must have watched him perform hundreds of times. He never knew whether I was in the audience or not. I was just a kid who lived in the neighborhood and would go and see the shows. And so I'm sure he knew that I learned a lot from him, and I'm sure I told him that before he passed. But that was a real lesson to me, and I think to all of us who might. Mentorship isn't always a chosen responsibility. Sometimes it's just a thing that we find ourselves doing, and it's not up to us. We're just in the position, and other people are observing us. And so I really learned that from him, and I've learned that from my students too, that I need to be aware of what I'm doing and aware of the choices I'm making, and how visible my actions are in a position of authority in the theater, but perhaps just in life in general, because they're watching and they may have deemed me a mentor, even though I may not think of myself as one in that relationship. So anyway, I think that's a good kind of thing that comes out of it in terms of mentorship. But to your, I don't know if you want me to keep speaking, but to your previous thing, regarding the spirituality, that is a big aspect of what draws me to the theater as well. I just think it is a very spiritual kind of practice, because it encompasses so much of what we would also relate to a spiritual journey, undertaking a goal, and then sort of moving toward that goal, and at times you are sort of veering and you're not quite sure and you doubt yourself, and you have to go through kind of a lot to arrive at the end result. um, and certainly the Greeks absolutely saw the theater as a spiritual practice. One of their ancient theaters, which is still there, you can visit it, is in a town called Epidaurus. And right next to this perfectly preserved theater was like their version of a hospital. And so they believed that if the soul in was healed, that the body would follow. So they didn't really know how to heal you all that well in the sense that we would in Western medicine, but you would go to this hospital and then you would go and watch the plays, which were an inherently spiritual festival context. And the idea was you'd watch a character going through something awful, you'd experience something of that pain. It would tap into your own trapped emotions and your own anxieties and your own bottled up junk, you would release it. And that's the catharsis that Barney mentioned at the top there. And the catharsis would heal you. And so there's a lot of opportunity for healing in the theater, whether that is a public kind of thing or in, as Jacob, you said, with communion. That is, and I don't mean to I don't mean to reduce communion and say that it is only some sort of act of theater, but Aristotle said that theater is an imitation of an action. That's what theater is. And so what is communion if not an imitation of Jesus' action of this ritualized opportunity to be together? And so I think that somehow, when you are doing communion, participating in it, it's almost like there's something really mystical about repetition. And every time you do it, the ritual, you're not just doing it that time, you're also somehow revisiting the same one every time. It's like a repeated, it's somehow unique, but it's somehow also all of them at once again. And that's just a really beautiful thing. So I think there are a lot of parallels there that have really been significant for me anyway.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really meaningful. As you're talking there at the end about a repeated experience that we enter into again and again, somehow there's connection with the first time, each new time. I was thinking of a book that I had read years ago called The End of Memory by Miroslav Volf. And in that book, he talks about trauma. And he said, sometimes we're stuck with a memory of pain. And for him to put the memory of the gospel story of the life of Jesus, his own suffering, and movement to resurrection and new life on top of his personal story, somehow gave him increased capacity to work through his own struggle. And then he talks about how that's part of the process of coming to the end of memory, the end of this thing that has you in bondage, as is the other story being laid on top of yours. And that image makes me think a little bit about what you're saying here about a ritual, and maybe even in a broader sense about theater. When another story is laid on top of ours, sometimes that can bring a new insight and hope and a way forward. I don't know if that resonates with you, or that language he uses or not.
Oh yeah, I think that's everything. That's everything. That's the whole reason that that theater continues to be meaningful. That's what it is. And that's what myth is. And myth is just a story that perhaps never happened, but also is somehow always happening to someone. And it's just there's just been enough instances of those that we've collected them and tried to preserve them, but they're really hard to preserve, except in sometimes nonsensical kind of stories that are hard to decipher. But that's what the theater is, and that's why, as I look at your wonderful wall of the comics behind you, and that's what the comics are as well, is mythology. And that's the reason that, every time you go to see the next Batman, you're not really seeing that with fresh eyes. You're also bringing with you the ghosts, or the kind of the memories of all the other Batmans you've seen, and imposing those upon that performance. And that's what makes that a kind of mythology. And the same is true of Hamlet. Hamlet is, in some sense, is definitely a myth, but is in some ways more real, like, than I will ever be. People will know Hamlet in hundreds of years, as they have for hundreds of years, and yet he's never existed. But his words have existed, and somehow that's more real than I think I am, at least in terms of cultural memory. So whenever we have someone playing Hamlet, we're even subconsciously comparing what we see to every other version we've seen, or if not, in the absence of other versions, we're comparing it to our own experience or our own, kind of experience of the things he's going through. So that's absolutely the only thing that makes theater meaningful, is what you just said so beautifully. It's the layering of experience and memory, and the mechanism for doing that is imitation, and is myth, which is its own kind of imitation and repetition of or reiteration of story. So yeah, it's absolutely, you're right on with that. Yeah.
Yeah, as I was getting ready for today and thinking, what could I contribute? What kind of ways could I help today's episode progress and go along? It came to me, especially maybe inspired by last week's topic talking about history. It came to my realization that you know, music and theater are these old ancient art forms, and as Chris mentioned, and it came to my mind, and then Chris just reinforced it with music. You're limited, you're bound by the instruments of your culture, of what it is that your society, your community uses to make music from. But with theater, you just need yourself, or a few props, or just some motions, it's just the imagination of the people that are there with you. And we see this, and again, speaking to what Chris was saying, people who can't speak Italian go to watch operas. People who can't speak Mandarin go to watch operas too. And they get the story. They give them a book of the play and they'll just say, this is in Italian, I can't read it. Make them listen to Chinese music that's sung in Mandarin. They'll say, I can't understand it. But take them to the opera, take them to the musical, take them to the theater, and they get something from it, even if they don't know the synopsis of what it is. And it's the combination of seeing this live, of this living event in front of you, and the feeling, the reactions, maybe in the ether of the people around you, feeling, especially the people who know what it's about and can understand the language, of getting this emotion that you get from theater. And just kind of as my final thought, I think, and again, to answer the question at the beginning of the show, there is something so timeless about theater that, you can't watch it on TV. You can't experience it any other way than with people as a part of a community, and getting this sense of we're hopefully receiving this gift that the actors are intending to give to us, hopefully presented wonderfully, and we all leave changed because of our past experiences that we bring to it, and what it made us feel, and then how we go forward from there after that experience. And I'm just so thankful that we had the chance to explore this topic again today, and that Chris was indeed the person to guide us through that today. And so thank you.
Yes, I want to echo what Barney just shared too. Thank you, Chris, so much for joining us and sharing your experiences, your vision, your understanding of theater. And I found it really inspiring. I hope too that our audience, as you have listened, that you've learned something new about theater, how it can enrich your life, how it can challenge you, how you can think in new ways in light of it. And we look forward to joining you again in future episodes. So until next time, goodbye.